Time now for The Clash. As we were discussing earlier in the show, the UN issued a code red climate change report warning that long-term effects of global warming, such as sea level rises and the melting of Arctic ice, are inevitable and irreversible. Rapid and drastic changes are needed, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to prevent extreme weather events and widespread devastation. However, critics have fired back at the report for failing to provide constructive solutions and using unnecessarily alarmist messaging. Professor Richard Betts, MBE, who is one of the authors of the report, the head of climate impacts research at the Met Office and the chair of climate impacts at the University of Exeter, says we need to be cutting emissions faster, especially given how unprepared we are for extreme weather conditions. However, Michael Schallenberger, environmental author of Apocalypse Never, says most environmental trends, including emissions, are going in the right direction, and reports such as this are traumatizing children. So let me bring you in first, Professor. Tell me, how bad is this report? Because code red emergency sounds like we're facing the destruction of the planet as we know it. Is that what you believe?
I think it's important to distinguish between what the media is saying and what the scientific report is saying, which is actually much more measured. This scientific report is an outcome of 3 years of work of collating all the scientific evidence and going through it very carefully and taking a very balanced view. Obviously, the media or certain sections of the media are going to spin it in a certain ways, and this is what always happens. So I think you should focus on what the science says. And the science says, yes, climate change is definitely happening. Humans are causing it. That's now beyond doubt. Some types of extreme weather events are getting more severe, and that's going to keep happening if we keep putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. However, the report is not saying that we've passed the point of no return and all is lost and we're heading for doom. The report is clearly saying if we do reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we can avoid the worst impacts in the longer term. So it's actually much more measured, and I think it's important to get to that part of that.
But Michael Schallenberger, you say that this language is alarmist, children might be terrified, and in fact things are heading in the right direction, which is the opposite of what the report says.
Well, that's right. And I agree with Richard that the media has done a real disservice. I think the United Nations officials have as well. But I mean, Richard himself told The Guardian that we're hopelessly unprepared for extreme weather events. That's just false. We're more prepared than we've ever been. Deaths from natural disasters are at an all-time low. They've declined by 90% around the world. They've declined by 99% in places like Bangladesh. We've seen there's no increase in the cost of natural disasters once you account for rising wealth. These are things that people don't know. The media simply don't report the fact that all of these trends are going in the right direction, including the fact that carbon emissions have been going down in Britain, France, and Germany since the mid-70s. Carbon emissions have declined in the United States by 22% since the year 2005. People are simply not being told these basic facts to provide the context. Yes, all else being equal, we would not want any climate change whatsoever. We wouldn't want temperatures to change at all. We wouldn't want to get colder or hotter. But we've got almost 8 billion people in the world. The population is increasing. Everybody wants to live a decent life. They deserve to live a decent life, and that requires consuming energy. And these important facts of context are simply being excluded from the conversation. That's what's been making it so alarmist. That's why 1 out of 4 British children are having nightmares about climate change. It's why there's widespread hysteria and anxiety among school children, including adolescents. My daughter's age, she's fine, but her friends are terrified. Some of them say they don't want to have kids. I think that's grossly irresponsible, and I think it's important for scientists, including Richard and others who are involved in this process, to speak out very clearly that we're going to have a better future than the better future and better lives than our grandparents and parents had. I was just with my parents and my aunts and uncles in Indiana, where they lived on a farm where they used horses before they transitioned to tractors. They suffered all sorts of diseases. People died. That future, that is not in our future. That's in our past. We've got serious problems to worry about. Some of them have to do with rising levels of anxiety and depression among adolescents, including rising levels of suicide. I think young people need to know that climate change is not something that they're going to address by marching in the streets. if they want to get involved in advocating for nuclear power plants, as I and my colleagues have done around the world over the last 5 years, including advocating for nuclear power plants in Britain, that's great. But this kind of helplessness, the safetyism, the neuroticism, I think it's completely inappropriate. And it's high time that scientists start to speak out against it and provide some of the basic context and facts that I think will make people feel a lot more optimistic about these trends.
Richard Betts, one of the other issues that I have is that the UK seems to be targeted so often in the rhetoric, whereas actually we've done so much more than virtually any developed nation. Why aren't we talking more about China, which is responsible for 29.1% of the world's emissions and seemingly has absolutely no plans to change that anytime soon? Why does the report not focus more on that nation?
Well, this particular report is just focusing on the science of climate change and what's happening and why. It's not within the scope of this report to talk about which individual countries are doing what and so on. But to come back to Mike's point about my comments about being unprepared, hopelessly unprepared for climate change, I do stand by that. I was involved in a UK report earlier this year, which was about adaptation to climate change, so living with the changes that we've already put in place. And through that, we did thoroughly go through an assessment of whether we are adapted to climate change at the moment. Do we have the right level of flood defences? Are our homes built to cope with high temperatures? And the answer is no, we're not. So one of the things we have to do is to put these things in place to live better with climate change. But this is all part of some work that is done by the UK's Climate Change Committee, which is part of the UK's Climate Change Act. And one of the roles of that is to set an example to the rest of the world. It is true that our emissions as a country are small compared to the rest of the world, but what we can do is to show the right direction to go in. And it could be the choices we make on energy production. I mean, Mike mentioned nuclear power earlier. I think the conversation we need to have now is not, is climate change happening or not? Everyone agrees that it is. But the conversation we do need to have, which is much more important, is how do we deal with it? Do we go for 100% renewables? That's probably not possible to meet our energy needs. Do we need more nuclear power, as Mike advocates? That's where the conversation needs to be now. I think it's much more constructive to focus on that.
Michael, is there an issue with the UN being the boy who cried wolf? I mean, I've gone back and looked at all of the comments today. In 1972, Maurice Strong, the first UN environmental program director, said the world had just 10 years to avoid catastrophe. Similar messaging in 82, similar messaging in 1990, saying that it would all be over by the turn of the millennium. Aren't some people like me who've lived through this and was terrified as a child by that messaging in the 1980s now saying, well, hang on a moment, you told us it was all going to be over then and we're still here and things are getting better?
Well, yeah, and there's a significant amount of gaslighting that goes on. So, for example, you'll see UN officials, you'll see scientists themselves say things like, we only have 10 years to act, or the world's going to fall apart, or whole islands will be wiped off the face of the earth. And then when people push back, they'll say, well, I just meant that this was important for us to act within the next 10 years to reduce emissions so that we don't reach 1.5 degrees. And they qualify it later. It's completely irresponsible. I'll give you another example of it. Today, the United Nations Secretary General comes out and says it's code red, red alert, emergency. We have to act. And then when you kind of go, well, look, I mean, nobody's actually predicting in any of the IPCC science that deaths from natural disasters will go up in the future. There's simply no science for that. There's no basis for anybody, and nobody's claiming it, that we're going to see more people dying from floods or hurricanes or any of the disasters associated with climate change. And yet when you push them on it, and they say, well, this is just a report about the science. We're not getting into the impacts. But it was all coordinated with the United Nations Environment Program to engage in this kind of alarmism. I mean, I think it's quite irresponsible. There's a lot of things for people to worry about in the world. And when you go and burden young people, I mean, to make it into the dream life of adolescents in Britain. So 1 out of 4 of them are having nightmares about this. It's utterly irresponsible. They terrified my generation about nuclear weapons. Then when the risk of nuclear war went down after the Cold War, they turned to climate change to give themselves meaning and purpose in life and a platform for something to scare people with. There is reason to act on climate change. But it's the same reason, we should have it as the same motivation for acting on things like cancer or obesity or other long-term serious chronic problems, not in this apocalyptic frame.
No, I hear you, because absolutely, when I was growing up in the 80s, it was all about the depleting ozone layer, because I was down under, and I was one of these kids that was absolutely terrified. So look, Professor Betts, let me ask you, you are one of the authors of this report. It's been just talked about all over the world today. So you have achieved the aim of getting this issue back to the top of the news agenda in virtually every country around the world, probably other than China, I imagine. But just be honest, how scared should we be?
I actually am in favour of optimism and not fear. I'm with Mike on this. Productive at all. It's very clear that if we continue to put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we will be making climate change more and more severe. But it's also clear that we do have the solutions at our fingertips. So we should look at it in that way and get on and do the right things, but not be motivated by fear, by seeing it as an opportunity to make life better in other ways, reinventing our energy systems, reinventing our transport systems, and working together as a team more, and so on. So I think it's an opportunity and not a threat, and definitely we should avoid scaring children. I'm completely on board with that. We need to say that the future is yours to make. So do the right thing and be positive about it. And don't be terrified.
Thank you so much. Fascinating discussion. That was Professor Richard Betts, MBE, the head of climate impacts research at the Met Office and the chair of the climate impacts at the University of Exeter, one of the authors of today's report that the world is talking about, and Michael Schallenberger, environmental author of Apocalypse Never. Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.